I will just jump right into our slides and talk to you a little bit about the Department of Labor. We are responsible for promoting welfare for job applicants, those who earn wages, and retirees. We work to improve working conditions, create advancement opportunities for profitable employment. We strengthen collective bargaining agreements and track unemployment and employment. Some of our sub-agencies that most people are familiar with are the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So every month when you see those job numbers, that's the agency that is responsible for those. OSHA, an organization that everybody hears about from the second that they step into a workplace at 15 or 16, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, working to make sure that our workplaces are safe. We have the Wage and Hour Division, who work to make sure that we earn fair wages. We also have the Office of Workers' Compensation Programs, Mine Safety and Health Administration, so making sure that our mines are safe for our miners. We also have an international presence with the Bureau of International Labor Affairs that works to strengthen labor standards across the world. We have approximately 14,000 employees all over the country. We have approximately 61 regional and district offices. So you can imagine that we are very busy right now with the pandemic and its impact on workers. I always tell people that records isn't a very sexy subject matter until there's an emergency. And here we are in the middle of a global emergency. So it just points out how important records management is, especially at a time when we are all working remotely. So the Departmental Records Management Program is responsible for setting policy for the department. We are responsible for providing oversight and guidance to our 21 sub-agencies. We have 24 agency records officers. We have 11 record groups and approximately 300 record control schedules. So we have regulatory agencies, investigatory agencies, and adjudicatory agencies. So we have a lot of different kinds of records. We are responsible for issuing the department's annual records management training. We are responsible for updating the departmental directive as needed, and we brief our senior officials and presidential appointees. So our reporting structures, we sit in the administrative arm of the department. So we are in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Administration and Management, in the Business Operations Center, in the Office of Asset and Resource Management. And then we have oversight, as I mentioned, over all of our agency records officers. So just a little bit about our coordination with our senior agency official for records management. Our SAORM is our Career Deputy Assistant Secretary for Administration and Management. I tell people this all the time. We are very fortunate at the Department of Labor. We have senior leadership buy-in from the most senior levels of the agency. We generally meet with our SAORM and our Assistant Secretary bi-weekly. And then, of course, we have ad hoc discussions as necessary. Now, it's always interesting to see where records management is located in our government agencies. As I mentioned, we happen to be in the administrative arm of our agency. And so the Office of the Chief Information Officer is actually like a sibling office. We work closely with them, but we don't sit in that unit. So we work closely with OCIO on capstone policies, electronic messaging policies, and of course the electronic records management system acquisition. We also recently just underwent an OIG audit, and so we worked closely with them as well on that. So again, they're close to us, so we can meet with them as needed. Okay, so the purpose of this discussion today, what are we doing to meet the M1921 deadlines? In 2017, NARA conducted an audit of our records management program. One of the recommendations that came from that inspection was that we weren't doing an internal assessment of our records management program. So one of the first things that we did last year was we conducted a department-wide internal evaluation. to determine whether or not our agencies were compliant with records management policies, and then how ready they were to move to a paperless environment. Then we next analyzed the results of the internal evaluation, and we developed corrective action plans for each agency. One of the parts of the internal evaluation was to also develop and update file plans. We wanted to ensure that we were capturing all of our electronic permanent records. We're also, the directive to our agency records officers right now is to accession any eligible permanent records to NARA. And that also goes for temporary records. One of the things that we have going on at the Department of Labor right now is we're going through a big clean. So you can imagine we have this old 2 million square foot building, and we are working to clean that building. And so part of that is to make sure that we get our records in order and get anything that's eligible out of the building while we still can. We also conducted a cost estimate on the digitization of permanent records. A lot of what we discovered was that it is cost prohibitive to most of our agencies. Now, that said, in the future, we are going to look to doing like a blanket purchase agreement with a vendor that could provide services to our agencies that have the budget to do digitization. The Department of Labor has one of the largest libraries in the government, and we look to see how much it would cost to digitize our card catalog, and it was completely out of the scope of our budget. So we're looking to see what we can do within the budget that we have. We've also drafted a performance work statement for an electronic records management system, and we've sent out a request for information. So mostly we've completed our market research. What we have in progress right now is a draft memorandum to agency heads announcing the M1921 deadline. So it's a directive that would go out to all of our agency heads to let them know that this change is coming and that they can prepare as much as possible by making changes to some of their procedures, especially with our historically paper-based agencies. How would they move to a paperless environment? We're working with our CIO and our procurement office to develop an acquisition plan for an electronic records management system. As I mentioned, we developed those plans of corrective action, and we're using those to begin remediation efforts. So what I am doing is once a quarter, I'm meeting with all of our agency records officers to talk about the recommendations that came from those corrective action plans and what they need from our office to help them get ready for M1921 deadlines and how they can better prepare their agencies. We're in the process of finalizing the acquisition package and looking to begin the procurement process. We also want to make sure that this year we modify our departmental training module to include changes to electronic record policies, and then also update our departmental directive to reflect those electronic record policies. And then, of course, we want to make sure that everyone is aware that this change is coming, and we want to begin our outreach efforts. So we have run into some challenges. We were full steam ahead, and then we recently did a presentation to our Enterprise Architecture Review Board, and that review board consists of IT points of contact throughout the agency. And so there were some concerns about privacy amongst the agencies about some of the system requirements. And then, of course, I mentioned, we have a lot of historically paper-based agencies, and how are we going to convince them to move to a digital format? As I mentioned, there's always budgetary constraints. I mentioned that we are in an old 2 million square foot building. We're also going through a consolidation project. And so there are competing priorities with our working capital fund. And then, of course, there's the ongoing conversations with leadership about the best path forward, and everyone coming to a consensus on the best way to move forward. As I mentioned, we are very fortunate at the Department of Labor to have leadership buy-in. And in November, we were thrilled that an electronic messaging policy was sent out to all of our agency heads. And I worked very closely with Lisa Haralampis and Lawrence Brewer. They were critical in giving us some guidance on that. So for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward policy, which is that with text messaging, please don't create federal records using text messages, but in the event that you do, you must capture and preserve those messages. Because of a collective bargaining agreement, the use of instant or chat messaging to create records is prohibited. We recommend that our employees use chat and instant messaging for reaching out to their colleagues or their friends. What time is that meeting? Let's get lunch. But they should, by and large, be transitory conversations. Social media is mostly managed by the Office of Public Affairs, but we always stress that any official posts on behalf of the department must be managed in accordance with record retention policies. And then, of course, we always want to make sure that folks understand that any posts made by an employee on their personal account are subject to Hatch Act and ethics rules. So I had a conversation a couple days ago with a vendor who mentioned that, every time he goes to a bridge meeting, all the records officers are still talking about Capstone. And, we should be past this discussion point. Well, unfortunately, Capstone is still a hot topic. Email, I think, will always be a hot topic. And it's no different at the Department of Labor. We use Microsoft Office 365. We use the standard GRS 6.1 schedule to manage our email. We have our designated senior officials whose emails are permanent, and the rest of us are retained for 7 years. But part of the reason that email is always going to be a topic of discussion is because it's not so much the policy as it is implementing the policy. So one of the issues that we came across was, how do we implement rolling deletion for non-Capstone employees? So meaning, when that email becomes 7 years and 1 day old, how do we make sure that we're deleting these emails as they age? And then we also have ongoing concern for some of our employees that have been with the department for a decade or more, especially our Capstone officials who may have personal or non-record emails in their accounts. I know of one Capstone official who's concerned about conversations about picking up the dog from the vet, or conversations she's had with her husband. So how are they culling those emails? How are they tagging those emails so that we make sure that, 15 years from their departure, that those emails are not sent to the National Archives for preservation. So the other issue that we've come across is the enforcement of the email policy. Our Capstone officials are put on a litigation hold, and so they can't delete their emails, but for the rest of us, we can delete our emails. So how do we enforce the email policy so that folks aren't deleting records? And then we also still, because the policy and the implementation of the policy aren't aligned at the moment, we still need to figure out how to update our directive to include those Capstone and email management policies. So long-term goals for Department of Labor, I think these are probably similar across the government. We, of course, want to acquire an enterprise-wide electronic records management system. We see that will reduce storage costs. It's very expensive to store records at a commercial storage facility. And so we only have a few years left to store those at the federal record centers. We believe that maintaining A centralized storage of our records would create more efficient oversight of our electronic records. We also want to overhaul our annual training module and our departmental directives to include these new policies on permanent and temporary records. And then, of course, I always say the job of the records officer is to make sure that folks have the resources and tools that they need to be their own records managers. In a department of 14,000 people, the best way to make sure everybody understands their requirements is through outreach and communication. So we want to make sure to increase that communication to ensure compliance. So lessons learned, I always like to talk about this at the end of my presentations. I mentioned earlier that when we presented to the Enterprise Architecture Review Board that there were these concerns about privacy for the system requirements. And so I think this is a good place to point that out because, as a records officer, we were, full steam ahead, ready to acquire an electronic records management system without considering some of the concerns of non-records management people. So, for example, some of our investigatory agencies were concerned about an invasive system coming in and looking at sensitive private records, or having a file analysis system crawling through their records. And so it's always important to take a step back and to involve non-records management colleagues for input, because that was a moment where I said, wow, I didn't even consider that. And so we did have to hit pause and to reconsider how we were going to move forward. I always say this to everybody: relationship building is key to any successful records management program. When your records management contacts and your program management contacts, like you, they're more willing to participate and comply. And so I think it's always important to take a look at what's working and what is not, and of course, be open to new ideas. And with that, I will open the floor for questions or comments.
Thank you very, very much. And let me see what we've got here. Let's see. One was a very specific and direct question. Is your department's electronic message policy publicly available?
I've shared it with NARA, as I mentioned, but I am more than willing to share it. I've shared it throughout the government already. I have my contact information up, and send me an email and I'm happy to share it.
Thank you. And then a more general question of, will the records digitization effort need to take place on-site or off-site?
I think that it could be a hybrid approach depending on the size and scope of the project. I mean, we have agencies that are really big, and then we have agencies that only have a few people. So it would just depend on, how many records we would want scanned. I think for us, our focus has been on permanent, so our most historically valuable records, and then long-term temporary records. So we have, like, the Job Corps centers are part of the Department of Labor, our Employment and Training Administration, and those records have to be retained for 75 years. So, our focus right now is on permanent records and long-term temporary records. So it would just depend on, what budget some of our agencies have and the size of the project.
Very good. And then the last thing, which I'd encourage you, if we need a detailed answer, to just take up in the chat room afterwards, but was, when do you anticipate having your digitization standards developed? Because one attendee from CMS would be interested in having follow-on discussions about your requirement development.
A lot of that is largely dependent on NARA. I mean, they're still working on the regs for digitization standards. So, it just, it's going to depend on them and getting that up on the Federal Register and when that's actually official. But I'm happy to discuss with anyone that would like to collaborate.
Thank you again for taking time today and sharing your story. Again, the contact information is on screen, and I'd encourage people to take the conversation not offline, but to a different channel online.